What if I told you that your brain decides whether you can trust someone in just a few seconds, and that, most of the time, that decision is wrong? Before you even realize it, before any conscious reflection, your brain has already chosen a side. To trust or distrust. To get closer or to distance yourself. To like or reject. Everything happens too fast for you to question it, and that's precisely where the trap lies. Have you ever experienced this? Meeting someone and, in a matter of moments, feeling like you already know what this person is like. A look, a way of speaking, a body posture. And that's it. The impression is formed. The curious thing is that this feeling comes accompanied by something even more dangerous. Certainty. The brain doesn't just create the first impression, it makes you trust it as if it were fact. And the most intriguing thing is that this seems natural, comfortable, automatic. After all, our brain loves speed. It was shaped to make quick decisions, to identify patterns, to judge situations before danger appears. But the world has changed, and the brain continues to use the same mental shortcuts from thousands of years ago. The result? A silent error that influences relationships, choices, judgments, and even important life opportunities. Stay with me until the end because what you're about to discover might surprise you. This overconfidence in first impressions is neither magical intuition nor a sixth sense. It's a strange phenomenon of the human brain. This is a cognitive bias that operates behind the scenes, manipulating how you perceive people, situations, and even the reality around you. And the scariest part is, the more intelligent someone considers themselves, the more they tend to rely on this error. Perhaps you've thought something like, "I didn't like that person," or, "At first I felt I couldn't trust them." These phrases seem harmless, but they carry a powerful underlying decision. From that moment on, the brain begins to act as an advocate for its own opinion. It selects information, interprets behaviors, and ignores contrary signals just to keep that first impression alive. This happens because the brain hates uncertainty. It prefers a quick answer, even if it's wrong, rather than admitting, "I don't know." So it constructs a coherent story in record time, based on very little data. A detail becomes personality. A gesture becomes character. An expression becomes intention. And all of this seems to make sense, within the narrative created by the brain itself. The problem is that, once this narrative takes hold, it becomes resistant to change. New information is filtered. Anything that confirms the first impression is highlighted. Anything that contradicts it is minimized, rationalized, or simply ignored. Without realizing it, you are no longer observing reality, you are defending the first version that your brain invented. And this is where this mistake becomes truly dangerous. Because it doesn't just happen in casual encounters. It influences professional decisions, romantic relationships, moral judgments, and even how you interpret the behavior of people close to you. How many times has someone been unfairly labeled? How many opportunities have been discarded because of a misleading first impression? The most disturbing thing is realizing that this trap is invisible. You don't feel like you're being deceived. On the contrary, you feel safe, confident, clear. And that's precisely why it's so difficult to question. The brain makes it seem like the first impression is obvious, logical, and indisputable. But what if she doesn't go? What if what seems so clear in the first few seconds is just a poorly calibrated mental shortcut? What follows will reveal how this error is formed, why it is so convincing, and why the brain insists on trusting it so much. And perhaps, by understanding this, you will never look at a first impression the same way again. And perhaps, as you listen to all this, a specific situation has already come to mind. A meeting, a conversation, a person you judged too quickly, or someone who judged you before even knowing you. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. It could be an experience, a feeling, or even a question. When you write, you're not just talking to me, you're helping other people realize they're not alone in this. And if at any point you thought, "Wow, this happens to me more than I imagined," consider liking this video. This simple gesture shows the algorithm that this type of content needs to reach further, to reach more people who also experience these silent conflicts created by their own brains. Each like is like a little push to keep this conversation going. Now, if you feel you enjoy looking at the human brain without overly romanticizing it, without easy answers, but with curiosity, depth, and a bit of discomfort, subscribe to the channel. Seriously. This space only grows because there are people who want to better understand their own minds, question automatic certainties, and see beyond the surface. Your subscription is a clear sign that this type of content matters. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of reflection. Each comment creates a real exchange. Each like expands the reach, each subscription strengthens this small community of people curious about the strange mysteries of the brain and human behavior. Now that you've realized that first impressions aren't as reliable as they seem, it's worth digging a little deeper. Because the way this error is formed, and the reason why the brain clings to it so strongly, reveals something even more unsettling about how your mind constructs reality. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the moment when the brain decides before you do it completely changes the way you view your own decisions. There's an invisible moment, almost impossible to perceive, when the brain has already reached a conclusion while your consciousness is still loading. When you feel that something was automatic, too fast to think about, that's not your imagination, that's exactly what happened. The brain doesn't wait for you to reflect. It doesn't ask for permission. It observes small signs, fragments of information, micro-details that go unnoticed by conscious attention, and in fractions of a second constructs an interpretation. Before you can formulate any rational thought, the judgment has already been made. The feeling that remains afterward is just the justification. I can't explain it, I just felt it. And that's where the danger lies. This mechanism stems from an ancient need. For much of human history, overthinking meant death. The brain evolved to decide quickly, even with incomplete data. It prefers to err fast than to hesitate. The problem is that this survival logic continues to operate in a completely different world, full of nuances, complex social contexts, and relationships that don't fit into instantaneous decisions. The brain continues to use old shortcuts to solve modern problems. When someone enters your field of vision, the brain begins a silent scan. Facial expression, posture, tone of voice, way of moving, small patterns that it associates with past experiences. None of this passes through the conscious filter at first. It's a behind-the-scenes process. And when you realize it, a feeling has already been established. Trust, distrust, sympathy, or rejection. Consciousness enters later, almost like a narrator who arrives late and tries to make sense of what has already happened. That's why first impressions seem so convincing. They come ready-made, packaged with emotional security. The brain delivers not only a judgment but also a feeling of certainty. And the conscious mind loves this because certainty brings comfort. Doubt is tiring. Uncertainty is unsettling. Questioning requires energy. So, instead of investigating, consciousness accepts the automatic verdict and moves on as if it were true. The problem is that this initial judgment is rarely neutral. It carries projections, past experiences, unresolved fears, expectations, and even beliefs you don't remember having formed. The brain doesn't analyze the person or situation as it really is, it compares it to internal files. It silently asks, does this resemble something I already know? If the answer is yes, the decision is accelerated. If it's no, distrust arises. This is where the transformation starts to get uncomfortable. Because realizing this means admitting that many decisions you believe to have been rational were actually born from automatic impulses. Consciousness then comes in to organize the narrative, creating elegant explanations for something that was already decided. The feeling of control is often a well-constructed illusion. This process has a direct impact on how you choose, judge, and react. It influences professional decisions, personal relationships, and even how you define who deserves trust and who doesn't. And the faster the judgment happens, the harder it becomes to question it later. The brain creates a coherent line of reasoning, even when starting from a weak premise. It doesn't seek truth, it seeks consistency. There's a hidden truth here that almost no one realizes. The brain confuses speed with accuracy. If something is decided quickly, it interprets that as efficiency. But efficiency is not synonymous with success. Often it's just saving mental effort. The brain is always trying to expend less energy, even if this generates distortions. And these distortions shape your mindset without you realizing it. When you feel it was automatic, that doesn't mean it was correct. It only means the process happened outside your field of consciousness. And everything that happens outside of consciousness seems natural, inevitable, almost intuitive. But intuition isn't magic. It's compressed memory, filtered experience, and accumulated biases operating at high speed. This is one of the most intriguing behind-the-scenes aspects of the human mind. The brain decides first, consciousness agrees later. And the more blindly you trust this process, the stronger it becomes. Questioning requires pausing. It requires discomfort. It requires accepting that not every immediate sensation deserves to be followed. But the brain doesn't like that. It prefers the fluidity of quick certainty to the complexity of slow reflection. And perhaps now you're beginning to realize how many times this dynamic has influenced your journey without you even noticing. How many choices were made based on initial feelings that were never revisited? How many people were judged by a minimal snapshot of their behavior? How many opportunities were discarded before they were even understood? This realization isn't about guilt. It's about awareness. It's about understanding that the brain does exactly what it's been trained to do: decide quickly. The problem arises when you believe that these automatic decisions represent the complete reality. They don't. They're just the first draft of perception, not the final text. And when you begin to see this, something changes. A small space emerges between the stimulus and the response. An almost imperceptible yet powerful interval. It is in this space that consciousness can truly enter. Not to deny the automatic judgment, but to question it. To ask if that initial impression deserves so much credence. Because when the brain decides before you do, it's not concerned with fairness, depth, or context. It's concerned with speed. And speed often comes at too high a price. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why the brain loves mental shortcuts.it completely changes how you view that mistake. And the first thing that needs to be clear is this: trusting too much in first impressions is not a sign of ignorance, lack of character, or moral failing. It is, above all, a survival mechanism. The brain doesn't do this to sabotage you, it does it to protect you. The problem is that this protection comes at a hidden cost. The human brain was shaped in an environment where speed mattered more than accuracy. Faced with a threat, there was no time for deep analysis, careful consideration, or data review. Decisions had to be made quickly. Flee or stay. Trust or distrust. Approach or avoid. Those who hesitated too much left no descendants. Those who erred quickly sometimes survived. This logic is deeply ingrained in the mind's inner workings. That's why the brain has developed mental shortcuts, simplified ways of interpreting reality with the least possible effort. These shortcuts don't seek the complete truth. They seek efficiency. They reduce the complexity of the world to familiar patterns. Instead of analyzing each person as a new universe, the brain asks, does this resemble something I already know? If the answer is yes, it saves energy and decides on the spot. This preference for speed is so strong that, for the brain, an imperfect answer now is better than a precise answer later. Precision requires time, focus, comparison, and review. All of this consumes energy. And the brain is, above all, an obsessive energy manager. It is always trying to do more while spending less, even if this distorts the perception of reality. This is where error disguises itself as virtue. When you decide quickly, the brain interprets it as competence. When you feel immediate certainty, it understands it as mental clarity. But in practice, many of these quick decisions are merely automatic reflexes of past experiences, old beliefs, and associations that don't always make sense in the present. Still, the brain trusts them because they are easy. This logic profoundly affects the mindset with which you view the world. Gradually, you begin to confuse familiarity with truth. What seems familiar sounds safer. What deviates from the norm generates strangeness. Not because it's bad, but because it demands more cognitive effort. The brain prefers the familiar not because it's better, but because it's cheaper in terms of mental energy. And that explains why changing your mind is so difficult. When a mental shortcut is activated, it doesn't come alone. It brings with it an emotional feeling that reinforces the decision. Comfort, relief, security. Questioning this shortcut means giving up that comfort and accepting uncertainty. And uncertainty to the brain sounds like risk. Even when there is no real danger at all. There's a hidden truth in this process that's rarely discussed. The brain wasn't designed to seek absolute truth. It was designed to keep you alive. The search for truth is a cultural, rational, conscious construct. Mental shortcuts, on the other hand, belong to an older, automatic, and instinctive layer. When these two layers clash, the faster one almost always wins. The impact of this on one's personal journey is enormous. How many important decisions are made based on unexamined initial impressions? How many relationships begin or end because of hasty judgments? How many opportunities are accepted or rejected without the person realizing they are simply following an automatic pattern? These shortcuts silently shape choices, while the conscious mind believes it is in control. The most intriguing thing is that the more tired, overwhelmed, or emotionally involved you are, the more your brain resorts to these shortcuts. In moments of stress, it further reduces precision to gain speed. It's as if it's saying, we don't have the energy to think now, let's decide quickly and move on. And often you don't even realize it's happened. This doesn't mean that mental shortcuts are always bad. They are useful, necessary, and unavoidable. The problem arises when you start blindly relying on them in contexts that demand more depth, more listening, more observation. That's when the survival mechanism begins to generate distortions. What was protection becomes limitation. What was efficiency becomes rigidity. And here begins an interesting transformation process. When you understand that the brain prefers speed to accuracy, you stop blaming yourself and start observing. You realize that that quick certainty might just be a shortcut in action, not a definitive revelation. This perception doesn't eliminate the automatic impulse, but it creates a small crack of awareness. That crack is everything. It's where the possibility of real choice resides. Not impulsive choice but conscious choice. Not automatic reaction but a thoughtful response. It's in that space that you begin to wonder if that first impression really deserves so much power. If that instantaneous decision reflects reality or just the shortest path your brain found. And the more you realize these behind-the-scenes workings are at play, the clearer it becomes that many of your certainties didn't stem from deep analysis, but from quick shortcuts. This doesn't invalidate your experience. It merely reveals how it was constructed. It reveals that the human mind is efficient but not neutral, quick but not impartial. This understanding doesn't end the matter. On the contrary, it opens a door. Because if the brain loves shortcuts, there's an even deeper reason why it clings so much to first impressions and resists any information that tries to dismantle them. And that's exactly where things start to get even more unsettling. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where the real problem lies. It's not just about forming a quick first impression. That, in itself, would already be problematic. The central point is, when that first impression becomes reality within your mind. When what began as an automatic hunch transforms into a silent, fixed label that begins to guide all subsequent interpretations. From that moment on, the brain stops observing and starts confirming. This initial label acts like an invisible lens. Everything you see afterward passes through it. Every gesture, every word, every attitude of the other person is interpreted in the light of that original impression. If the label was positive, the brain softens mistakes, relativizes flaws, and finds justifications. If it was negative, it amplifies small slips, ignores context, and constructs a narrative consistent with the initial distrust. Reality ceases to be evaluated for what it is, it becomes adapted to the label. What's most unsettling is that this process happens behind the scenes, without announcement, without warning. You don't feel like you're distorting anything. On the contrary, you feel like you're being lucid, attentive, observant. The brain delivers ready-made interpretations and the consciousness accepts them because everything seems to make sense. That's the power of confirmation. It creates such a strong sense of internal logic that questioning it seems unnecessary. There's a hidden truth here that's rarely noticed. The brain doesn't like to revise past decisions. Revising an initial impression means admitting it might have been wrong. And admitting error requires energy expenditure, emotional discomfort, and often a minor identity crisis. So, instead of reassessing, the brain chooses the simplest path. It confirms. It looks for evidence to support the first version of the story and discards the rest. This mechanism is deeply linked to a self-protective mindset. Maintaining a stable narrative gives the brain a sense of control. Changing one's mind, on the other hand, creates instability. It's as if the brain is saying, if I was wrong here, where else could I be wrong? To avoid this cascading effect, it prefers to maintain the initial label, even if it distorts perception. The impact of this on day-to-day decisions is enormous. Relationships develop or deteriorate based on biased interpretations. Conversations are read through emotional filters. Intentions are attributed without verification. And the more time passes, the harder it becomes to dismantle this label, because it is reinforced by small, accumulated confirmations. The brain builds an internal dossier, carefully edited to prove that it was right from the start. This process creates a powerful illusion that you are merely reacting to what you see. But, in practice, you are reacting to the meaning that the brain decided to assign right from the start. The first impression becomes the starting point of an interpretative journey that is rarely questioned. And the most curious thing is that the more intelligent and articulate a person is, the better they tend to be at justifying this process. The mind finds sophisticated explanations to defend a label that was born from an automatic impulse. This explains why discussions rarely change opinions. When someone presents information contrary to the initial label, the brain doesn't evaluate it neutrally. It goes into defensive mode. Questions are then seen as attacks. Data become exceptions. Contrary evidence is reinterpreted until it fits the existing narrative. It's not that the person doesn't understand, it's that the brain has already chosen what needs to be true. This specific mistake has a silent but profound effect on the journey of personal transformation. Because while you believe you are seeing reality clearly, you are actually navigating an old map, drawn in the first few seconds of contact. The mind begins to confuse internal coherence with external truth. If the story makes sense in your head, it seems true, even when it doesn't correspond to the facts. The most delicate thing is realizing that this mechanism isn't limited to judgments about other people. It also applies to situations, opportunities, and even oneself. How many times does a negative initial experience become an internal label? This isn't for me, I'm not good at this, it always goes wrong. The first impression crystallizes and begins to filter all future attempts. The brain confirms the label and calls it reality. Behind the scenes, what's happening is both simple and frightening. The brain is trading curiosity for consistency. It prefers to maintain a stable narrative rather than explore new interpretations. But this choice comes at a cost. It limits perception, impoverishes understanding, and reduces the capacity for change. Transformation requires revision, and revision requires cognitive courage, something the brain by default avoids. When you start to see this pattern, something changes. A healthy sense of unease arises. You begin to distrust not people but certainties that are too quick to appear. You realize that perhaps that initial impression was just a draft, not the final work. That perhaps the label created says more about the shortcuts your brain uses than about reality itself. This realization doesn't destroy automatic judgment, it will continue to exist. But it creates a crack. A space where consciousness can enter and question whether what is being confirmed truly deserves the status as truth. Because often what seems like deep conviction is merely a repetition of an initial error that was never revised. And when that crack opens, it becomes impossible not to notice the next step in this process. How small, seemingly irrelevant details gain disproportionate weight and transform into definitive evidence within the narrative that the brain has already decided to uphold. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where the mistake ceases to be merely an internal judgment and begins to take on a life of its own. It's the moment when an isolated detail it triggers a veritable domino effect within the mind. Something small, almost insignificant, takes on disproportionate weight and begins to reorganize the entire narrative that the brain constructs about a person or situation. And the most curious thing is that this detail alone would never support such a grand conclusion. But combined with the initial label, it becomes the perfect proof. Think of an unusual gesture. Nothing exaggerated. Perhaps someone crosses their arms while listening to you speak. The brain, which already had a formed initial impression, doesn't interpret this as a simple body movement. It translates it as closed-off behavior, resistance, disinterest. Consciousness accepts this interpretation because it fits perfectly into the story that was already being told behind the scenes. From then on, other similar gestures begin to be noticed more attentively, while contrary signals disappear from the radar. Or perhaps a glance out of context. A second too long looking away, a neutral expression at the wrong moment. The brain doesn't ask what that person was thinking, if they were tired, distracted, or just processing the conversation. It quickly fills in the gap. Distrust, judgment, lack of empathy. In a few moments, ambiguous behavior becomes a fixed personality trait. The detail becomes identity. And perhaps the most common example is a misinterpreted phrase. An unfortunate choice of words, a tone that sounds different from what was expected, an answer that is too short. The brain doesn't just hear the phrase, it hears it through the filter of first impressions. Meaning doesn't arise from what was said, but from what the initial label allows one to hear. The phrase comes to represent intention, character, positioning. And suddenly, everything that person says afterward is already loaded with suspicion or confirmation. This is how the domino effect takes hold. One detail leads to another. One interpretation leads to another. The brain begins to assemble a coherent narrative, connecting points that should never have been connected. Each new event is reinterpreted to strengthen the existing story. The mind is no longer observing reality, it's editing a script. What's most disturbing is that this narrative seems extremely logical to whoever constructs it. Everything makes sense internally. There's a beginning, a middle, and emotional coherence. The brain loves that. It prefers a well-structured story to a confusing reality. Even if this story is false, incomplete, or unfair, it offers something the brain highly values: predictability. This predictability brings psychological comfort. When you believe you already understand who someone is, the world seems more controllable. Fewer surprises, less effort. The brain feels safe. And this feeling of security further reinforces the created narrative. Questioning it begins to generate discomfort, as if it were a threat to internal stability. The impact of this on the human journey is profound. Relationships begin to be shaped by unspoken assumptions. Decisions are made based on partial interpretations. Conflicts arise not from what actually happened, but from the meaning attributed to small details. Often, two people experience completely different realities within the same situation, each sustaining a narrative that makes sense only within their own mind. There is a hidden truth in this process that is rarely confronted. The brain is not an impartial observer. It is a storyteller. And once it chooses the plot, it carefully selects the events that keep the narrative alive. Anything that threatens to derail the story is minimized, forgotten, or reinterpreted. Not out of malice but for mental economy. This domino effect also explains why misunderstandings escalate so quickly. An initial detail that is misinterpreted creates tension. The tension alters behavior. The altered behavior generates new, strange details that reinforce the initial narrative. The cycle feeds back on itself. In a short time, what began as a neutral gesture becomes a full-blown conflict, charged with emotions, judgments, and definitive conclusions. Behind the scenes, the brain believes it is merely reacting to facts. But in practice, it is reacting to its own interpretation of those facts. Objective reality becomes increasingly distant, while the internal narrative gains strength. And the longer this narrative persists, the harder it becomes to dismantle it, because it becomes part of the person's perceptual identity. This is a crucial turning point. Realizing that many of the certainties we hold are, in fact, fragile constructs supported by misinterpreted details. That many important decisions were influenced by a series of small distortions that were never reviewed. And that the brain, instead of correcting course, preferred to move forward to maintain a sense of coherence. When you begin to see this pattern, something silently changes. You start to distrust people less and the stories your mind creates about them more. You begin to realize that an isolated gesture rarely carries the meaning that the brain assigns to it. That a look is not a verdict. That a phrase does not define a complete intention. This awareness does not eliminate automatic judgment, but it weakens its power to dominate the entire narrative. And it is precisely at this point that an inevitable question arises. If so many details are interpreted in a distorted way, why does the brain insist on defending them so strongly? Why does it cling so tightly to these narratives, even when they begin to generate conflict, noise, and a negative impact on decisions? Write it in the comments. I see this domino effect. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because here we touch on one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the human mind. Why is it so difficult to change your mind after you've already formed a first impression? This is not just a curious detail about how the brain works, it is one of the most powerful mechanisms behind conflicts, rigid decisions, and internal narratives that withstand the test of time, even when they begin to have a negative impact. When the brain forms a first impression, it doesn't register it as a temporary hypothesis. It treats it as a starting point. A benchmark is established, a point of reference against which everything will be compared. And from that moment on, any information that threatens this benchmark is perceived as a problem. Not as new data but as a disturbance. That's why, when confronted, the brain reacts with discomfort. It feels threatened. This threat is not logical, it's emotional and energetic. Changing one's mind requires something the brain tries to avoid at all costs. Extra work revising an impression means going back, reprocessing information, reorganizing the internal narrative, admitting that something was wrong or incomplete. This consumes mental energy. And the brain, as we have already seen, is extremely economical. It hates to expend energy without feeling that there is a clear reward. There is also a deeper factor at play behind the scenes: identity. Many opinions are not just loose ideas, they become part of how a person perceives themselves in the world. When you strongly believe in something, that belief becomes part of your mindset, your internal history. Questioning it can feel like questioning yourself. The brain interprets this as risk. And risk, even symbolic risk, activates defense mechanisms. That's why, when faced with contradictory information, the brain rarely responds with immediate curiosity. It responds with justifications. It starts looking for flaws in the opposing argument, reservations, exceptions. Not to understand better, but to protect the existing structure. This protection doesn't happen because the person is stubborn by nature, but because the brain has been programmed to preserve stability. There's a hidden truth in this process. The brain confuses internal coherence with security. If the story it has constructed continues to make sense within its own mind, it feels comfortable, even if that story no longer aligns with external reality. Changing one's mind means accepting a period of temporary incoherence, and that's something the brain avoids whenever possible. Furthermore, there's the factor of emotional energy. Admitting that a first impression was wrong can generate shame, frustration, or regret. The brain tries to protect you from these unpleasant feelings. So it creates defensive shortcuts. It minimizes new information, discredits the source, changes the focus of the conversation. All to avoid the emotional cost of revision. This resistance becomes even stronger when the initial impression has been reinforced over time. Each small accumulated confirmation strengthens the emotional bond with the original narrative. The brain begins to invest in it, and the greater the investment, the greater the resistance to change. It's the classic "I've gone too far to turn back" effect. Even when the signs indicate that something needs to be revised, the brain prefers to persist. The impact of this on one's personal journey is silent, yet profound. How many decisions continue to be defended simply because they were made in the past? How many relationships remain trapped in outdated versions of the people involved? How many opportunities are rejected because they contradict an initial impression that has never been revisited? The brain transforms the past into an argument, when it should only use it as a reference. It's important to understand that changing your mind isn't a sign of cognitive weakness. On the contrary, it requires energy, openness, and mental maturity. But the brain doesn't operate with these values by default. It operates with efficiency, economy, and predictability. If an opinion is already formed and minimally functioning, it sees little reason to change it, even if, deep down, it's limiting growth and transformation. There is also a curious effect. The more someone is confronted aggressively, the more the brain shuts down. The attempt to force change further activates defense mechanisms. The brain enters cognitive survival mode. It doesn't listen to learn, it listens to rebut. This explains why heated debates rarely generate real change of opinion. Direct confrontation increases the energy and emotional cost of revision. Behind the scenes, the brain is always silently calculating, is it worth spending energy on this now? Most of the time the answer is no. So it maintains its opinion, even if it generates noise, conflict, or discomfort in the long run. The short term wins. Immediate stability wins. Transformation is postponed, or never happens. When you begin to perceive this pattern, something subtle happens. A new layer of awareness emerges. You start to notice when resistance appears. When the discomfort doesn't come from the information itself, but from the threat it represents to the existing narrative. This perception doesn't change everything at once, but it creates space. A small interval between the defensive impulse and the possibility of reflection. And this interval is powerful. It's where the chance lies to see that many opinions are not absolute truths, but constructs protected by the brain to conserve energy. That changing your mind isn't losing, it's updating. It's recognizing that the human journey isn't linear, and that the mind sometimes needs to expend energy to grow. But understanding this leads us to an even deeper question. If the brain resists change so much, how does it deal with the consequences of this rigidity? How does this difficulty in changing one's mind affect relationships, choices, and how you interpret the behavior of others over time? That's where the effects begin to spread in even more subtle ways. Comment below, I understand this resistance. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where everything stops being just a curious phenomenon of the brain and starts to directly affect real life. The silent consequences of this mistake, they don't appear blatantly. They don't arrive with warning, they don't make an immediate noise. They accumulate little by little, in the background of the mind, shaping decisions, relationships, and entire paths without you realizing it. And perhaps the most unsettling thing is precisely that, almost no one associates these consequences with the first impression that originated them. Misjudging people is perhaps the most common, and most underestimated, effect. How many times has someone been labeled cold, arrogant, uninterested, or incompetent because of an initial detail that was never reviewed? The brain creates a static image and begins to treat that person as if they were always like that. It doesn't matter the context, it doesn't matter the stage of life, it doesn't matter what has changed. The label overshadows the real human being. And, little by little, the relationship begins to exist more in the mind of the one judging than in the concrete reality of the other. This creates a profound distortion of empathy. When the brain believes it already knows who the other person is, it stops truly listening. It listens only to confirm. And this false sense of understanding creates distance. Conversations lose depth. Connections weaken. Dialogue becomes merely a superficial exchange, filtered through old expectations. The person on the other end feels this, even if they can't explain it. Something breaks there, silently. Bad decisions soon follow, almost as a natural consequence of this process. Deciding based on a distorted initial impression is like choosing a path by looking only at the first meter of the road. The brain believes it is being logical, but it is only being consistent with a flawed internal narrative. Professional choices, partnerships, projects, And even important life changes can be discarded or undertaken for reasons that have nothing to do with the complete reality. And the cruelest part is that, when these decisions go wrong, the brain rarely returns to its original point. It doesn't question the first impression. It finds new justifications. It blames external factors, bad luck, circumstances. The hidden truth, that it all began with a hasty judgment, remains invisible. The error perpetuates itself because it is never recognized as structural. Broken relationships are perhaps the most painful impact of this mechanism. Not just romantic relationships but friendships, family ties, professional connections. Small noises, misunderstandings, and misinterpretations accumulate until they form a wall. Each side believes it is reacting to facts, when in reality it is reacting to interpretations. The real story gets lost amidst the internal narratives. How many relationships ended without an honest conversation because the brain had already decided that it's not worth it? How many estrangements occurred not due to a lack of affection, but due to excessive assumptions? The first impression becomes a silent sentence, and no one realizes when judgment replaced curiosity. The emotional impact of this is profound because it involves frustration, hurt feelings, and the feeling that something could have been different. And then come the missed opportunities. Perhaps the hardest to perceive because they leave no visible marks. They are paths that were never explored, people who could have been allies, experiences that could have transformed the journey. All of this remains in the realm of what if. The brain, by trusting too much in first impressions, closes doors before even knowing what lies on the other side. These opportunities don't disappear dramatically. They simply pass by. And when you look back, you don't exactly see where you went wrong. You just feel that something was left behind. Your mindset narrows, your choices become more predictable, less daring, less open to new things. The brain calls this prudence. But often it's just fear disguised as logic. The key point is to understand that this is not a small, isolated, or rare mistake. It is structural. It's embedded in how the human brain works. It transcends cultures, ages, and levels of education. No one is immune. The more blindly you trust your own perception, the more vulnerable you become to this mechanism. Because the brain doesn't warn you when it's oversimplifying. The impact of this over time is cumulative. Small wrong judgments add up. Small, poorly reasoned decisions pile up. Small separations become great distances. And, when you realize it, you're living a reality shaped by choices that were never fully conscious. The journey seems coherent, but something doesn't fit. There's a lack of depth. A lack of connection. A lack of expansion. There's an unsettling revelation here. Many of the emotional pains we carry didn't stem from major traumas, but from a series of misinterpretations that were never questioned. The brain, in trying to protect, ended up limiting. In trying to simplify, it ended up impoverishing the human experience. And the hardest thing is admitting this, because it means recognizing that not everything we feel is certain deserves that status. When you begin to see these consequences, something changes inside. It's not guilt, it's clarity. You realize that paying attention to first impressions doesn't mean blindly obeying them. That there's a space between feeling and concluding. Between perceiving and labeling. This space is small but transformative. It's within this space that more conscious choices can emerge. And it is precisely at this point that an inevitable question arises. If this error causes so many silent impacts, is there any way to perceive when the brain is falling into this trap before the damage is done? Is there any internal signal that reveals that the mind has already begun to distort reality? Comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after understanding the impact of this mistake, an almost inevitable need arises: how to recognize when the brain has already fallen into this trap. And here it's important to make something very clear from the start. This isn't about correcting, fixing, or solving things yet. It's about awareness. It's about learning to recognize the silent signs that the mind has already taken control of the narrative before you even realize it. The first sign is usually certainty too quickly, that immediate feeling of absolute clarity. You meet someone, observe a situation, hear a few details, and suddenly feel like you get it all. There's no doubt, no curiosity, no internal questions. Just a firm, almost comfortable conclusion. The brain loves this feeling because it saves energy. But truly profound decisions rarely come with this kind of haste. This premature certainty doesn't present itself as something suspicious. On the contrary, it presents itself as intuition, lucidity, keen perception. The brain makes you feel you're being insightful when, in reality, you're just ending the process too early. And the stronger this certainty, the less openness there tends to be to any nuance. Everything starts to seem obvious, simple, resolved. And that's exactly where the error hides. Another clear sign is the automatic resistance to new information, not a healthy critical analysis, but an almost instantaneous rejection. When someone brings a different point of view, something inside you shuts down. A discomfort arises that's difficult to explain. It's not exactly anger, but it's not curiosity either. It's as if the information were unnecessary, irrelevant, or even inconvenient. The brain interprets it as a threat to the already established narrative. At that moment, the mind doesn't listen to understand, it listens to filter. It looks for flaws, exaggerations, inconsistencies. Not to evaluate fairly, but to keep the original story intact. And the most curious thing is that this resistance is usually accompanied by well-articulated rational justifications. The brain finds good arguments to defend a position that was born from an automatic impulse. There is also an even more subtle but extremely revealing sign. The feeling of, I already know what that person is like. This internal phrase seems harmless, but it carries enormous weight. It indicates that the brain has ended the observation process. The person ceases to be seen as someone in motion, in transformation, full of contradictions and contexts, and begins to be treated as a fixed concept. A static character within their mental narrative. When this happens, curiosity disappears. You no longer ask questions, you don't investigate, you don't listen deeply. Everything the other person does is interpreted as confirmation of that, I already know. Even positive actions are reinterpreted. Even real changes are viewed with suspicion. The brain prefers to believe it was right from the beginning rather than accept that reality is more complex. Another important clue appears in how you recall past interactions. The brain begins to edit the memory. Neutral situations take on negative or positive tones depending on the initial label. Inconvenient details are forgotten. Convenient details are amplified. The memory ceases to be a faithful record and becomes a reconstruction aligned with the dominant narrative. This further reinforces the feeling of certainty. This process also affects the body. Sometimes, the realization that the brain has fallen into the trap comes as a subtle tension, an emotional shutdown, an internal rigidity. The body reacts before consciousness. A slight discomfort when hearing something different. An urge to interrupt. An impatience that is difficult to justify. These physical signs are valuable clues to the mental workings behind the scenes. It's important to understand that recognizing these signs doesn't mean dismissing them. Automatic judgment continues to occur. The brain continues to create shortcuts. The difference is that, when you recognize the signs, something changes in your mindset. A small distance emerges between the impulse and total adherence to it. You begin to realize that certainty might just be a shortcut, not a revelation. This initial awareness is already a profound step on the journey of transformation. Because without recognizing the error, there is no real choice. Everything happens on autopilot. But when you recognize these signs, the rush to finish, the resistance to listening, the suppression of curiosity, you begin to see the workings of the mind from the outside, as if you were observing your own brain in action. And that's not comfortable. Often, noticing these signs generates an internal unease. A feeling of, maybe I'm oversimplifying. The brain doesn't like that feeling. It prefers the fluidity of certainty to the friction of doubt. But that friction is where growth resides. Not the final answer, but the openness. The central point here is not to change your mind immediately, nor to force an artificial neutrality. It's simply to recognize when the brain has decided too early. When the narrative is already formed before reality has been explored. When the mind confuses speed with depth and calls it clarity. This perception changes how you relate to your own conclusions. You start treating them as hypotheses, not as definitive statements. As drafts, not as final versions. This doesn't solve everything, but it creates space. And this space is fundamental because it prepares the ground for something even more important. Understanding how to question these certainties without entering into internal conflict, without activating the defense mechanisms that the brain so strongly protects. It is precisely at this point that the conversation begins to take on another layer. Because recognizing the trap is only the beginning. What truly transforms is understanding what to do with this awareness when it arises, amidst the decisions, relationships, and choices of daily life. Write it in the comments. I'm paying more attention to these signs. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because everything that has been said so far leads us, almost inevitably, to a single question. Simple in form but profoundly disturbing in effect. The question that dismantles the first impression that IT doesn't appear as a ready-made answer, nor as a magic solution. It comes as an invitation to discomfort, to pause, to silently reconsider what seemed so obvious just minutes ago. At some point in your journey, you've probably felt that instant conviction. The feeling of, I saw it and I understood it. The brain loves that moment. It feels relief. Reality seems organized, predictable, under control. But this organization has a hidden price. It reduces the complexity of the world to something that fits quickly into the mind. And almost nothing truly important fits that quickly. This question begins to resonate when you realize that first impressions don't stem from what you saw, but then what the brain decided to do with what it saw. That it's not a true photograph of reality, it's a rushed interpretation, a snapshot, a summary hastily put together behind the scenes of the mind. And yet it's treated as definitive truth. There is something profoundly human in this process. The brain cannot tolerate interpretive emptiness. It dislikes blank spaces. When information is lacking, it fills it in. When context is lacking, it invents connections. When there is insufficient data, it resorts to past experience, to known patterns, to stories that have worked before. Not because this is correct, but because it is functional. First impressions, in this sense, are less about the other person and more about you. About your filters, your references, your expectations. They say more about the path the brain chose to take than about the observed reality. And admitting this is a huge step in transforming your mindset, because it means recognizing that not all clarity is lucidity, sometimes it's just simplification. When you start to consider this possibility, something interesting happens. Certainty begins to lose its rigidity. It doesn't disappear, but it softens. It ceases to be a wall and becomes a hypothesis. And that changes everything. Because a hypothesis can be revised. A statement cannot. The brain prefers statements, but consciousness grows with hypotheses. This question also reveals something even deeper. The brain isn't interested in getting to know people, situations, or experiences in depth. It's interested in predicting behaviors, predicting risks, predicting outcomes. First impressions are an attempt to anticipate the future with as little effort as possible. The problem is that predicting is not the same as understanding. Understanding requires something the brain avoids: time, listening, openness, revision. It requires accepting that reality is ambiguous, contradictory, changeable. That people don't fit into fixed labels. That an isolated gesture doesn't define a character. That a phrase out of context doesn't reveal a complete intention. All of this requires energy. And the brain, true to its ancestral logic, tries to conserve it. There's a hidden truth here that changes how you look at your own decisions. Many choices weren't made because you wanted to, but because your brain felt it already had enough information. Many rejections didn't happen because of a lack of worth, but because of premature overconfidence. Many breakups didn't stem from real incompatibility, but from narratives constructed too early. This realization isn't meant to generate guilt. It's meant to generate freedom. Because when you understand that the first impression is just a shortcut, you gain the chance to choose whether you want to continue down it or explore other paths. You don't need to deny what you felt. You don't need to force an artificial neutrality. You just need to recognize that it was the beginning of the story, not the end. The question, what if what you saw first wasn't true, acts as a key. It doesn't overturn automatic judgment, but it weakens the absolute dominance it usually exerts. It creates a gap. An internal space where awareness can enter before the narrative crystallizes. And this space, however small, has a gigantic impact over time. This impact appears in how you listen, decide, and react. It appears in how you allow people to reveal themselves beyond the surface. It appears in your willingness to revise opinions without feeling that it threatens who you are. It appears in the courage to admit that some certainties were merely convenient shortcuts. This question also changes the relationship with error. Because, from this perspective, making a mistake doesn't mean failing as a person. It simply means having taken a path that was too fast. And fast paths don't always lead to the best destinations. Sometimes they only lead to the most familiar place. When you let that question resonate, something silently rearranges itself. The world becomes a little less predictable but more real. People become less moldable but more human. Decisions become slower but more aligned. The journey loses the illusion of total control but gains depth. And perhaps most importantly, this question doesn't need to be answered immediately. It doesn't ask for action, it asks for presence. It asks you to carry the doubt for a few more moments. To allow reality to reveal itself beyond the first glance. To accept that the brain did what it always does, chose the shortcut, and that now there is the possibility of looking again. Because ultimately the first impression isn't the problem. The problem is treating it as destiny. And when you realize that, it becomes impossible not to want to understand what happens when consciousness begins to intervene in this process in a more active, gentler, and more intentional way. Comment below. That question stayed with me. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this conversation has stayed with you. Maybe a question, maybe a feeling of unease, maybe that sensation of, this explains a lot. And that's exactly why this space exists. If this type of reflection helps you look at the brain, at decisions, and at relationships in a more conscious way, it makes sense to subscribe to the channel. That's how you can continue following this type of content at your own pace without any rush. If you'd like, you can also leave a comment saying you made it to the end. You can write something simple like, "This message was for me," or, "I'm with you until the end, I read," and that helps keep alive this silent exchange between those who create and those who watch. And if at any point you felt you agreed with, reflected on, or saw yourself in these ideas, leave a like on the video. Not as an obligation but as a sign of connection, that this conversation made sense to you. Now, if you want to continue on this journey, there's a video over there that complements this topic and delves even deeper into this strange workings of the brain. Click there and follow along.